A year later, at home, Mark brought groceries for our anniversary dinner and placed the receipt in my hand. Nothing hidden. I stared at the paper, remembering how another receipt had turned groceries into evidence, forced his brother out of our marriage, and made me leave with Lily and Peanut. This time, everything depended on what that small slip of paper truly meant. But I'll start at the beginning. On Friday, February 6th, my 8-year-old daughter stood in our kitchen wearing one purple mitten and announced that Peanut, her hamster, needed a winter emergency plan. Freezing rain ticked against the windows, slush clogged the curb outside our rented house, and I was trying to pack Lily's lunch before my first salon appointment. If you've ever watched ordinary family life turn strange over something small, subscribe to the channel, because I wish I had recognized the warning signs sooner. At the time, my biggest concern was convincing Lily that Peanut did not need a battery-powered heating pad inside his cage. My name is Claire Bennett. I was 31, had been married to Mark for 5 years, and rented a chair at a downtown salon in Marietta, Ohio. The salon was only 1.4 miles from our house, about a 5-minute drive when the streets were clear, which they definitely were not that morning. I loved my work because hair told the truth. Someone could claim she wanted just a trim, but the way she gripped the cape usually meant a breakup, a job interview, or a mother who had criticized her bangs since middle school. I was good at making people feel visible. At home, I had become good at making myself smaller. Mark was 34 and supervised a hardware store. He left early that Friday to deal with a delivery delayed by the ice, kissing Lily's forehead and calling over his shoulder that he would text me later. He was dependable in the practical ways that look impressive from the outside. He changed furnace filters, remembered which windshield wiper fit my car, and could locate a missing screwdriver by instinct. He also hated conflict, especially conflict involving his mother, Diane, or his older brother, Trevor. Mark called that keeping the peace. I had started to suspect it meant offering me up whenever the Bennetts needed somewhere to put their discomfort. Diane Bennett was 62, a retired school secretary with the sharp memory of someone who had spent decades tracking tardy slips and whispered excuses. She had disliked me almost from the beginning, although she expressed it through omissions rather than declarations. She forgot to include me in photographs, bought Mark and Lily matching holiday stockings, and once served everyone pie before mentioning there was none left for me. If I objected, she looked wounded. Mark would murmur that his mother was set in her ways, as if contempt were an antique cabinet nobody could move without damaging the floor. Trevor was different. At 37, he did not hide behind forgetfulness. He organized people. He recommended their insurance, questioned their purchases, corrected their parenting, and called afterward to make sure they had followed his advice. In 2022, a partner in his food truck business had concealed $18,000 in debt. Trevor came out of that mess believing secrecy had nearly ruined him, and supervision had saved him. Unfortunately, he applied that lesson to everyone. He said family needed transparency, accountability, and one person willing to think ahead. The one person was always Trevor, and thinking ahead always involved him gaining access to information that did not belong to him. That morning, Trevor texted Mark twice while I was scraping ice from my windshield. I knew because Mark had left his phone on the kitchen counter while searching for his work gloves, and Trevor's name flashed across the screen. The previews asked whether Mark had reviewed our spending and whether we were still overpaying for Claire's salon setup. I did not open the messages. I only stared until the screen went dark, then handed Mark his phone when he came back. He glanced at the notifications and slipped it into his coat without comment. That should have bothered me more than it did, but Lily was calling from the hallway because Peanut had buried his water dish again. My salon chair was tucked near a tall front window overlooking downtown. On gray days, the Ohio River seemed to pull all the color out of the town, but inside we had warm lights, chrome footrests, and the mixed scent of shampoo, coffee, and hairspray. I worked through a root touch-up, 2 cuts, and a color correction while wet snow tapped the glass. By late afternoon, my shoulders ached, but I felt the clean satisfaction that came with earning my own money. My monthly take-home pay was $3,200, and every dollar came from hours on my feet, listening carefully while my hands kept moving. Mark and I deposited our pay into a joint checking account, but we had a familiar division of expenses. His income handled rent and most utilities. Mine covered groceries, Lily's routine needs, and several other household costs. It was not legally separate money once it entered the account, but we both knew whose paycheck was paying for what. At least, I believed we did. Before leaving the salon, I checked my shopping list. Meat for several dinners, potatoes, breakfast food, packed lunch supplies, and ordinary staples. The supermarket was 2 miles from home, and I wanted everything bought before the roads iced over again. The parking lot had turned into a shallow lake of brown slush. Cartwheels jammed against ridges of frozen snow, and freezing rain collected on my coat sleeves while I loaded the trunk. Inside the store, I had calculated carefully. The meat cost $84, including packages I planned to divide and freeze. The potatoes were $18. The rest of the household food came to another $84. The total at the register was $186 exactly. I folded the receipt into my coat pocket instead of stuffing it into a grocery bag, mostly because the bags were damp and I needed it for my budget notes. At home, Lily helped me unpack by reading every label aloud as if she were hosting a cooking show. She carried the potatoes to the lower pantry shelf, then asked whether Peanut could eat one raw. I told her no and gave her a carrot shaving for him instead. I portioned some of the meat into freezer bags, leaving the rest in the refrigerator because I planned to cook it over the next few days. Mark arrived while I was wiping down the counter. His boots left wet half-moons on the floor, and his first words were not hello, but that's a lot of meat. I explained the meal plan. He nodded, though his eyes stayed on the refrigerator. Dinner that night was simple, and for a while the house felt like the version of my life I kept defending. Lily told us about a classmate who claimed Ohio had once been attached to Antarctica. Mark laughed so hard he coughed into his napkin. Afterward, he repaired the loose latch on Peanut's cage while I braided Lily's hair for bed. Watching them together softened me. That was part of why I excused so much. Mark was patient with our daughter. He knew how she liked the hallway light left on and never teased her for whispering goodnight to a hamster. I confused tenderness in one part of a person with safety in every other part. Once Lily was asleep, Mark sat beside me on the couch and mentioned that Trevor was planning something for Diane on Sunday. He called it a family afternoon and said the weather might improve enough for them to use Diane's backyard. A February backyard gathering sounded ridiculous, but Trevor owned a canopy and treated bad weather like a personal challenge. I asked whether Lily and I were expected. Mark rubbed his thumb along the television remote and said he did not know the details yet. The answer landed strangely because Diane's house was only 3.8 miles away, about 9 minutes by car. This was not a distant event requiring complicated arrangements. I asked if Trevor had said anything about me. Mark sighed before I had finished the question, which was his usual way of making my concern feel exhausting. He said his brother was only trying to keep Diane relaxed and that I should not read hostility into everything. I reminded him that Diane had not spoken directly to me since an argument over Christmas plans. Mark replied that she needed time. When I asked how much time a 62-year-old woman required to decide whether her son's wife deserved basic courtesy, he stood and carried his empty glass to the kitchen. The conversation ended because he physically removed himself from it. Saturday morning, February 7th, I woke to the sound of the back door shutting. The freezing rain had stopped, but the sky was the color of dirty wool. Mark's side of the bed was empty. I assumed he had gone out to salt the steps until I heard his truck start, idle briefly, then pull away. Lily was still asleep, and Peanut was running in his wheel with frantic purpose. I made coffee, opened the refrigerator for creamer, and noticed the lower shelf looked wrong. The stacked freezer bags were gone. So were the packages I had left chilled for the weekend. At first, I thought Mark had moved them to the chest freezer, but that held only ice trays and a forgotten bag of peas. I opened the pantry. The shelf where Lily had placed the potatoes was empty too. There was no torn bag, no spilled dirt, nothing to suggest they had been moved for breakfast. I checked the counter and found my folded grocery receipt, which must have slipped from my coat when I hung it up. I laid it beside the empty place where the missing potatoes had been and stared at the total. $186. My money, my planning, my work, and somebody had emptied the shelves without asking. Mark returned less than 20 minutes later. He came through the kitchen carrying his keys and smelling of cold air and gasoline. I pointed at the refrigerator and asked where the groceries were. Mark did not pretend to misunderstand. He said he had taken the meat to Diane's house because Trevor was preparing for the cookout and had underestimated what they needed. The potatoes had gone too because Trevor planned to make foil packets. Mark spoke as if he had borrowed a ladder, not removed several days of meals from our kitchen while I was asleep. "The meat is yours, but the potatoes are ours? I paid for all of it," I said. "Every package, every potato." Mark leaned against the counter and rolled his eyes. "Mom needs the meat for her backyard cookout. You weren't invited. She still doesn't like you." His bluntness stunned me more than an excuse would have. There was no apology, only irritation that I had forced him to say the ugly part aloud. He added that Trevor considered the groceries a family contribution and that Diane had already started thawing the meat. In other words, returning it would inconvenience the people who had stolen it, so I was expected to absorb the loss. Something in me stopped negotiating. "You let Trevor dress control up as care, chose their contempt over your wife, and stole food I paid for." Mark's face tightened at the word stole. He insisted it could not be stealing because we were married and the groceries had been bought from our joint account. I picked up the receipt and flattened it against the counter. My paycheck had funded that shopping trip, I reminded him, and marriage did not mean he could empty our refrigerator for a party designed to exclude me. Mark said I was turning food into a loyalty test. I told him he had done that the moment he loaded it into his truck. Lily wandered in before either of us could say more, her hair tangled across one cheek. She looked from me to Mark, then opened the pantry and asked where the potatoes had gone. Mark told her Grandma Diane needed them. Lily brightened and asked whether we were having dinner there. The silence that followed was so immediate that even an 8-year-old understood something was wrong. Mark finally said the plans were still being figured out. I folded the receipt again and slipped it into my coat pocket before Lily could see my hands shaking. Once she was feeding Peanut, Mark lowered his voice and told me he would talk to Diane. He said he had not realized how bad it sounded until he heard himself explain it in front of Lily. For one hopeful minute, I believed shame had reached him. He promised he would tell his mother that excluding me while accepting food from our home was unacceptable. If Diane refused to include all 3 of us, he said, none of us would attend. I asked him to bring the groceries back regardless. He hesitated, then said the meat was already being prepared, but Diane would reimburse the full $84. What would you have done right then? Accepted repayment? Demanded the food back? Or refused to let your spouse take your child to that cookout? Tell me in the comments, because I spent the rest of Saturday wondering whether insisting on respect made me difficult or merely awake. Mark acted almost normal. He made grilled cheese for Lily, cleaned the wet boot marks from the floor, and avoided his phone whenever Trevor's name appeared. That evening, he even said, "I should have asked you." It was not the apology I needed, but I treated it like the beginning of one. Sunday, February 8th arrived with low clouds and a hard wind that rattled the aluminum downspout. Around noon, Mark showered and put on a clean flannel shirt. When I asked why, he said Diane had agreed that Lily could come to the cookout. I waited for the rest. There was none. Mark claimed his mother was not ready to see me, but Trevor thought keeping Lily away would punish Diane for an adult disagreement. I reminded him of his promise that either all of us would go or none of us would. He stared at the floor and said the situation had become more complicated overnight. It had not become complicated. Trevor had called and Mark had folded. I told him Lily was not a peace offering he could carry between angry adults. Mark replied that she loved her grandmother and should not be dragged into our conflict. apparently missing that taking her to a party where her mother was deliberately excluded dragged her directly through the center of it. Lily was already dressed because Mark had told her she could go before speaking to me. She stood in the hallway hugging her coat, excitement fading as she listened. I would not make her believe she had caused the argument, so I knelt, zipped her coat, and told her I would pick her up if she wanted to come home. Mark left with her less than an hour later. Through the front window, I watched his truck disappear down our slushy street. I had never felt so unnecessary inside my own house. The empty refrigerator hummed behind me, and Peanut scratched through his bedding in Lily's room. I tried to clean, but every ordinary object seemed to accuse me. 3 plates in the cabinet, 3 hooks by the door, 3 names on Lily's school forms. Yet on that Sunday, my husband had reduced our family to 2 people who were welcome and 1 whose groceries were. Lily called from Mark's phone later and asked me to bring her other purple mitten. She had taken only 1 again, and Trevor had organized a beanbag game in the yard. I could have told Mark to handle it, but Lily's fingers got painfully cold, and Diane's house was only 3.8 miles away. I drove there with the mitten on the passenger seat, repeating that I would hand it over and leave. 9 minutes later, I turned onto Diane's street and saw Trevor's canopy rising above the backyard fence like a gray tent. Smoke rolled beneath it, trapped by clear plastic side panels. Mark stood near the grill while Diane arranged serving dishes on a folding table. My potatoes sat in a foil pan beside trays of meat I recognized from the store, packaging stacked near the trash can. Lily spotted me through the open gate and ran over. Before I could give her the mitten, Trevor stepped between me and the yard. He did not greet me. He asked why I had come when Diane had made her wishes clear. I held up the mitten and said I was there for my daughter. Then I asked why food purchased with my earnings was being served at an event where I was not permitted to enter. Trevor crossed his arms and explained that Mark had contributed household groceries to a family gathering. He said my fixation on who paid for individual items proved why someone needed to supervise our finances. When I asked what our finances had to do with him, he gave me a patient smile I had seen him use on people he considered reckless. He said Mark had requested his help because my salon income was inconsistent and I spent emotionally. My income was not inconsistent. My take-home pay was $3,200 a month, and Trevor knew that exact figure. I had never told him. The realization cut through my anger so sharply that I glanced at Mark. He stood under the canopy holding metal tongs, watching us, but not moving. Trevor continued, saying he had reviewed enough information to recognize that I treated money as mine whenever it suited me and ours whenever bills were due. He even knew I paid for Lily's routine needs and groceries, while Mark handled rent and most utilities. I asked Mark, in front of his mother and brother, what he had shared. He set down the tongs and walked toward us, but Diane told me not to create a spectacle in front of Lily. That was rich, considering they had built the spectacle and placed my daughter inside it. Mark said Trevor had only helped him look at our budget. I asked whether looking included my deposits, salon expenses, and shopping history. Mark said we would discuss it at home. Trevor cut in to say there was nothing inappropriate about one brother protecting another from financial blind spots. You took my groceries and reviewed my income without my consent, I said. Which part was protection? Trevor's expression hardened. He said I was proving his point by becoming combative instead of grateful. Diane turned away and began moving serving spoons as though my humiliation were an unpleasant sound from a neighbor's yard. Lily pressed against my side, her mitten forgotten in my hand. I told Mark I was taking her home. He objected that they had not eaten yet, but Lily quietly said she wanted to go with me. That ended the argument, although Mark's silence as we left told me he blamed me for the ruined afternoon rather than the people who had engineered it. On the drive home, Lily asked why Grandma did not like me. I gripped the steering wheel and said adults sometimes held on to unfair opinions because admitting they were wrong felt difficult. She considered that, then asked whether Grandma had taken our dinner. I said yes, but that none of it was Lily's fault. At home, we made scrambled eggs and toast because the planned food was sitting under Trevor's canopy. Lily fed Peanut a tiny piece of plain egg and drew a picture of our house with all three of us standing outside. She included Mark, even though he did not return until after dark. When he came in, he looked exhausted rather than sorry. He said Trevor had been offended by my accusation, and Diane had cried after we left. I asked whether either of them felt bad that Lily had watched her mother stopped at the gate while her food was served inside. Mark said I could have handed over the mitten without starting anything. That was when the false hope from Saturday finally collapsed. He had not spoken to Diane on my behalf. He had spoken to Trevor, accepted new instructions, and then lied to me long enough to get Lily dressed. Monday morning, February 9th, I checked the joint account before leaving for the salon. The supermarket charge for $186 had cleared. There was no reimbursement from Diane, no transfer from Mark, and no pending credit for the meat. What I did see was worse. Several recent account views from times when I had been working, plus a downloaded statement I had not created. Mark had apparently been logging in, exporting our transactions, and sending the information to Trevor. My coffee cooled beside the laptop while I traced the pattern. Trevor had not guessed my income from one conversation. He had studied my deposits, salon rent, grocery charges, and every debit card purchase closely enough to build a case against me. When Mark came into the kitchen, I turned the laptop toward him and asked who had downloaded the statements. His eyes moved to the screen, then away. He admitted he had sent Trevor copies because Trevor was experienced with business debt and could identify dangerous habits. I asked what danger he had found in hair products, school supplies, and food. Mark said that was not the point. The point was that I became defensive whenever anybody questioned me. I could barely believe the trap. If I stayed calm, Trevor could keep inspecting my life. If I objected, my objection became proof that inspection was necessary. I challenged Mark about the $84 he had promised Diane would repay. He said his mother believed groceries contributed by her son did not require reimbursement, but he would cover the meat himself. I told him replacing money after taking something did not erase the taking, especially when the potatoes and the rest of my planning had been treated as disposable. Mark transferred the full $84 before leaving for work. I watched the deposit appear, but relief never came. He had repaid the price of the meat while refusing to acknowledge the price of standing at his mother's grill as she excluded me. At the salon, I nicked my knuckle on a foil cutter because my hands would not settle. The cut was shallow, but the bright bead of blood made me sit down in the supply room with my fingers pressed into a towel. I had spent years telling clients that changing their hair could not fix a person who mistreated them. Yet I had mistaken endurance for maturity inside my own marriage. Through the wall, dryers hummed and someone laughed near the shampoo bowls. I listened to ordinary life continuing a few feet away and felt sealed behind glass. The woman who rented the chair beside mine noticed before I could hide it. Her name was Marisol Vega, and she had a gift for asking one clean question instead of offering 10 pieces of advice. She found me staring at the folded grocery receipt, which I had pulled from my coat pocket without realizing it, and asked whether I was safe at home. I said Mark had never hit me. Marisol did not look reassured. She said safety included access to money, privacy, transportation, and the right to make ordinary decisions without another adult appointing himself your supervisor. That sentence broke something open. I told her about the cookout, the gate, Trevor's knowledge of my deposits, and Mark's promise that vanished overnight. Shame made the story come out in fragments. Marisol listened without turning it into gossip or telling me to leave immediately. Instead, she asked whether I could identify exactly which money in the joint account remained from my pay after the expenses I had agreed to cover. I said I kept budget notes and receipts for taxes and household planning. She told me to preserve copies somewhere Mark could not access, then helped me scan the grocery receipt and the relevant records during my break. I drove home that evening expecting another argument, but Mark had chosen a more effective punishment: wounded politeness. He asked Lily about school, warmed leftovers he had bought on his way home, and spoke to me only when necessary. After Lily went to bed, I heard him tell Trevor on the phone that I was still escalating. He lowered his voice when I entered the hall, but not before I caught Trevor saying that Mark needed to stop rewarding emotional behavior. Mark shut the bedroom door afterward and slept facing the wall, leaving a strip of cold sheet between us that felt wider than Diane's backyard gate. By Tuesday, my body was keeping score. My jaw ached from clenching it, and every notification made my stomach contract. Mark changed the password on the joint banking login, then claimed the bank had required a security reset. He gave me the new password when I insisted, but his delay told me what mattered. He believed he could control the door and still call the room shared. I changed the passwords on my email, salon scheduling account, and cloud storage. I also turned on additional login security and saved copies of my pay records where neither brother could reach them. That night, Lily asked why Mark and I were whispering so much. I told her adults sometimes disagreed about fairness, but both of us loved her. She accepted that answer, then carried Peanut's cage into her room because, she said, the kitchen felt too serious. After she went upstairs, Mark accused me of making the house uncomfortable. I asked whether he had considered that sharing my financial records might be the source of the discomfort. He said Trevor was family and would never misuse them. I reminded him that Trevor's own business disaster had taught him to fear secrecy, not granted him authority over everyone else's bank account. Wednesday, February 11th, Trevor called while I was sweeping hair from around my chair. I almost ignored him, but Marisol glanced over and quietly switched off the nearby dryer so I could hear. Trevor did not ask whether it was a good time. He demanded that I apologize for upsetting the family, embarrassing Diane in her own yard, and making Mark feel caught between his wife and his relatives. His tone was managerial, as though he were documenting a problem employee. He said my behavior proved why private decisions could not always be left to me. Then he delivered the belief beneath every missing invitation, every shared statement, and every command disguised as concern. Family decides what's best for you, Trevor said. I looked at myself in the mirror, tired eyes, color on my sleeve, shoulders curved as though I were apologizing for occupying my own chair. I straightened. I decide what's best for me. Trevor went silent, then warned me not to make a financial move I would regret. I ended the call before he could turn the warning into another lecture, but my hands shook so hard that Marisol took the broom from me. If your spouse let a relative monitor your money and then blamed you for objecting, would you quietly prepare to protect yourself? Write yes or no, and by the end, you'll know what I chose and what it cost me. That afternoon, I made my first decision without seeking Mark's permission. I scheduled an appointment at a different bank for Saturday when I had no clients. I did not drain anything, hide household funds, or touch Mark's pay. I began separating documentation from emotion, because Trevor could dismiss anger, but he could not rewrite deposits, cleared bills, and dated receipts. Marisol stayed after closing while I reconstructed the account activity. We matched my pay deposits against the groceries, Lily's routine expenses, and the other household costs I had agreed to cover. The $84 repayment for the meat remained clearly marked as Mark replacing what he had taken. Once the pending charges settled, the amount left from my own earnings was $1,430. I checked it repeatedly because I knew exactly what Trevor would claim. Not $1 of that balance came from Mark's income, and I photographed each step of the calculation before printing the records. At home, Mark was waiting at the table with his phone face down. He asked whether I had spoken to Trevor, and when I said yes, he told me I had been disrespectful. I asked why his brother had authority to summon an apology from me. Mark rubbed both hands over his face and said Trevor was trying to prevent our marriage from collapsing. The answer was so backward that I laughed once, without humor. Trevor had crossed our boundary, Mark had opened the gate for him, and now they were presenting the intruder as the structural engineer. I told Mark no more statements, screenshots, passwords, or conversations about my earnings were to be shared with Trevor. Mark agreed too quickly, then added that married people should not keep financial secrets. I said privacy from his brother was not secrecy from my husband. He wanted access to everything while reserving the right to distribute it. When I asked him to tell Trevor, in front of me, that the financial reviews were over, Mark refused. He said he would handle his own family in his own way. I understood then that his own way meant waiting until I grew too exhausted to demand proof. Thursday passed in a tense imitation of routine. I cut hair, answered Lily's homework questions, and slept badly. Diane sent Mark messages that made him sigh theatrically whenever I entered the room. He finally told me she felt robbed of time with Lily because I had removed her from the cookout. I asked whether Diane felt any responsibility for excluding Lily's mother. Mark said his mother was old enough to choose whom she welcomed into her home. I agreed. Then I said I was old enough to choose whether my child participated in events built around humiliating me. He looked startled, as though choices only became cruel when I made them. Friday evening, 1 week after I bought the groceries, Mark found the printed records in my work bag. He did not open the folder in front of me, but he asked why I was building a case. I took it from his hand and said I was documenting my own money. His expression shifted from suspicion to fear, and for a moment I saw the husband beneath Trevor's training. He asked whether I planned to leave him. I answered honestly. I had not decided what would happen to our marriage, but I had decided nobody else would control the conditions under which I stayed. He slept on the couch that night. I lay awake listening to the furnace cycle and the faint rattle of Peanut's wheel from Lily's room. Losing Mark did not feel dramatic. It felt like realizing I might already have lost the version of him I kept defending. I cried silently into the edge of my pillow, not because I regretted protecting myself, but because protection had become necessary. By morning, grief had burned down into something steadier. Cold sunshine filled the windows on Saturday, February 14th, sharpening every streak in the glass. At the bank, I opened an account in my name and transferred my remaining personal balance of $1,430 from the joint account. I took no shared money. I left Mark's income and all funds allocated to outstanding household obligations untouched, then saved the confirmation with my records. Afterward, I bought a plain black frame and placed the grocery receipt inside it at my salon. $186 had exposed the structure of my marriage. I hung the receipt near my station as proof that documentation could become a boundary. My phone rang before I finished straightening the frame. Mark had seen the transfer alert, and Trevor was with him. Mark demanded that I come home and explain myself. In the background, Trevor said this was exactly the kind of impulsive move he had predicted. I told them there was nothing impulsive about records, a week of warnings, and money earned by my own hands. Then I heard Trevor say they were coming downtown. Through the salon window, cold sunlight flashed across Mark's truck as it pulled to the curb, and both brothers got out. They crossed the salon in step, Mark pale and tight-jawed, Trevor wearing the calm expression he used when he expected obedience. It was Saturday, February 14th, 8 days after I had bought the groceries, and the cold afternoon sun threw their reflections across the mirrors before they reached my chair. Marisol was at the shampoo station sorting clean towels. She did not leave when Trevor glanced at her. I stood beneath the framed receipt with my transfer confirmation in one hand and my account records in the other, and for the first time all week, I was not trapped in their house, their backyard, or their version of events. Trevor pointed at the frame and asked whether public humiliation was my new financial strategy. Mark stared at the receipt as though I had framed a photograph of him committing a crime. He said moving money without consulting him violated everything I had demanded about transparency. I placed the confirmation on my counter and explained that the transferred balance came entirely from my pay after the expenses I had agreed to cover. No rent money, utility money, or portion of his paycheck had moved. Trevor dismissed that as creative accounting. So I opened the folder and spread out the deposit records, cleared charges, and my handwritten calculations beneath the bright salon lights. The joint account makes it marital money, Trevor said, keeping his voice measured for Marisol's benefit. You don't get to declare part of it yours because you're angry. I told him I had not declared anything based on anger. I had traced every deposit and expense, left all shared obligations funded, and transferred only the remaining $1,430 from my own earnings. Mark's $84 repayment was documented separately because it replaced the meat he had taken. Marisol stepped closer, looked over the pages, and confirmed that she had watched me reconstruct the figures before the transfer. Trevor's face changed when he realized I had a witness who understood the records. Mark asked why I had involved a coworker in our private marriage. The hypocrisy was so complete that even he seemed to hear it after the words left his mouth. I asked why involving Marisol was betrayal, while sending my statements to Trevor was protection. He had no answer. Trevor tried to redirect the conversation toward my pattern of emotional spending, but I asked him to identify one dangerous charge from the records he had reviewed. His eyes moved across the papers. There were salon supplies, groceries, Lily's needs, and ordinary household purchases. He could not name one. He had not found recklessness. He had simply decided that access entitled him to judgment. I took the framed receipt off its hook and held it between us. Here is the crisis you claim required supervision, I said. $84 for meat, $18 for potatoes, $84 for the rest of our household food. That is $186 exactly. Mark looked down. I reminded him that he had repaid the full $84 for the meat only after challenging him, while the potatoes had been carried to a party where Lily and he were welcomed, and I was not. The other $84 of household food had remained for our home. Every dollar was accounted for, and none of it supported Trevor's claim that I could not manage money. Trevor said the cookout had never been about humiliating me. It had been about respecting Diane's right to decide who entered her property. I agreed that Diane had that right. Then I said she did not have the right to demand my food, my daughter, or my silence while exercising it. Mark flinched when I mentioned Lily. I described her standing at the gate with one mitten, hearing Trevor tell her mother she was not welcome. Marisol stopped folding towels. The salon became so quiet that I could hear the heating vent click above us. Trevor's careful public voice finally cracked, and he accused me of using a child to punish the family. The only person who took family money for an event designed to exclude family is standing beside you, I told Mark, and it isn't me. Mark looked at Trevor then, not at me. Something passed across his face that I had been waiting years to see. Not confusion, not avoidance, but recognition. Trevor ordered him not to be manipulated by a rehearsed performance. Mark asked whether Trevor had known from the beginning that Diane would refuse to invite me. Trevor admitted he had. Mark then asked whether the suggestion to take our groceries had also come from him. Trevor said the food was already available and buying more would have been wasteful. That answer stripped away the last excuse. Mark had done the carrying, but Trevor had designed the logic that made theft sound efficient and exclusion sound respectful. Marisol quietly said she had heard enough to know the transfer was not impulsive. Trevor told her this was a family matter, and she answered that he had brought it into her workplace the moment he arrived to intimidate her coworker. He bristled at the word intimidate, insisting he had come to prevent Claire from damaging her marriage. Hearing my name spoken as though I were a project made Mark close his eyes. He admitted, in front of both of us, that Trevor had urged him to download the statements and had told him not to reimburse the meat until I calmed down. The transfer on Monday had been the first time Mark had disobeyed him. Trevor walked toward the front window, and Mark followed halfway before stopping. Marisol received a supply call and moved into the back room to answer it. Mark stepped outside to call Diane, leaving Trevor and me alone near the reception desk for less than a minute. Without witnesses, his shoulders dropped. He did not sound powerful then. He sounded frightened. If I don't keep track, people lie. Debt grows and everything falls apart, he said quietly. He believed it. The hidden $18,000 debt from his food truck partner had taught him that betrayal arrived disguised as normal life. I understood his fear, but understanding it did not require surrendering to it. I told him his former partner's dishonesty had injured him, but he had turned that injury into a permit to search everybody else. "You didn't prevent betrayal," I said. "You trained Mark to betray me before I could disappoint him." Trevor's mouth tightened, and the softness disappeared before Mark came back inside. He said Diane was furious and wanted the framed receipt removed because it made her look like a thief. I asked how a receipt hanging in a salon named her at all. Mark gave a tired, bitter laugh. Diane had recognized herself without being identified, which was the closest she had come to admitting what happened. Trevor demanded that Mark leave with him. This time, Mark said no. He told his brother that the statements were private, the review had been wrong, and there would be no more access to our account or discussions about my income. Trevor warned that Claire would isolate him from his family and ruin him financially. Mark looked at the evidence on my counter and said, "You told me she was the risk while you were teaching me to become one." Trevor went still. He had spent years positioning himself as the one person capable of seeing danger, and his younger brother had finally named where the danger was coming from. That should have felt like victory. Instead, I felt grief settle behind my ribs, because Mark's clarity had arrived only after I had done all the work of protecting myself. He turned to me and apologized in plain language, without mentioning Trevor's intentions or Diane's age. He said he had taken the food, broken his promise, shared the records, lied about the cookout, and allowed Lily to witness my exclusion. It was the apology I had wanted on Saturday morning. 1 week later, it could not restore what his choices had removed. I told him I believed he was sorry, but sorrow was not the same as safety. I said I would not return home with him that afternoon. Lily was spending the day at home under Mark's care, and I would pick her up after I arranged somewhere for us to stay temporarily. Mark asked whether I was ending the marriage. I told him I was ending the arrangement in which keeping our marriage required accepting supervision by his brother and contempt from his mother. Whether anything could be rebuilt would depend on sustained action, not one confrontation. Trevor scoffed that I had planned this outcome all along. I pointed to the receipt and said my original plan had been dinners for my household. He had helped turn groceries into evidence. Trevor left alone. His shoes struck the sidewalk hard enough for us to hear through the glass, and his truck pulled away while Mark remained by my chair. Diane called him twice, then called again. He silenced the phone instead of answering. That was a consequence, but it was not redemption. Before he left, Mark returned his key to my salon scheduling tablet, removed Trevor from every account contact he could access, and showed me the confirmation screens. I told him those were necessary steps, not bargaining chips. He nodded. For once, he did not ask me to reward basic decency by abandoning my boundary. Marisol helped me pack an overnight bag from the emergency clothes I kept at work, then drove behind me to the rented house so I would not walk into another family confrontation alone. Trevor was gone, but Diane's car sat at the curb. She stood in the living room telling Mark that I had poisoned him against his own mother. Lily was upstairs with Peanut, out of earshot. I told Diane I would not argue in front of my daughter and asked her to leave. She said it was her son's house, too. Mark answered that it was our rented home, and she had arrived without permission. Diane stared at him as if he had changed languages. She left after telling Mark he would regret choosing a woman who documented every mistake. I almost answered, but the framed receipt had already answered for me. I packed clothes for Lily and myself while Mark sat at the kitchen table. He asked where we were going. I gave him the address only after he promised not to share it with Diane or Trevor. He did not protest. When Lily came downstairs, I explained that we were having a few quiet nights away and that none of this was her fault. Mark knelt, hugged her, and apologized for letting grown-up problems spoil her weekend. She asked if Peanut could come. He could, so the three of us left together. The separation lasted 4 months. Mark began counseling, opened an account Trevor could not inspect, repaid every dollar, and stopped using silence as agreement when Diane criticized me. He never demanded progress reports from me. He simply did the work. Trevor sent one defensive email. I did not answer. Diane refused to visit unless the receipt came down. It stayed above my salon station, not as revenge, but as a reminder that small violations become systems when nobody names them. Mark and I eventually chose to rebuild, slowly, with separate finances, clear boundaries, and no family keys. Lily returned to a home where keeping the peace no longer meant sacrificing me to maintain it. A year later, Mark brought groceries home for our anniversary dinner. He placed the receipt in my hand and said, "Nothing hidden." I smiled, filed it away, and realized the old frame no longer hurt. I had bought food for a weekend, but what I finally brought home was the right to trust my own eyes. The moral? Love without boundaries becomes permission, but truth enforced by action becomes freedom. Thank you for staying with me. Subscribe to the channel for more stories about finding strength, dignity, and a way home.